Good evening, everyone, and welcome to Bible study for today, Wednesday, the 13th of April of 2022. I am the Reverend James Merriam. I'm the pastor here at the Wells River Congregational Church, and so I'd like to welcome each and every one of you to this time of devotion, this time of reflection, this time of togetherness, and this time when we have the opportunity to dive into a piece of Scripture that we otherwise might not get the chance to in the course of a given week. This is the Wednesday of Holy Week, so of course I would like to welcome and invite you all warmly to join either a local church or, if you're in the area, to join my church for our Thursday evening Maundy Thursday service. Often there are also Good Friday services in some churches. The Easter Vigil, which is sometimes held on Saturday evening or late Saturday night, are a wonderful, wonderful service. So if you have the opportunity to attend such a service, please, that's a wonderful idea. And then, of course, Easter Sunrise Service, which for us is at 7 o'clock at the Wells River Welcome Center, and then the 10 o'clock celebration of Easter morning this coming Sunday, 10 o'clock right here at the Wells River Church. Dear friends, welcome to Holy Week. Welcome to all of its ups and its downs. We're going to take the opportunity today perhaps to jump ahead a little bit in the story, because Wednesday is still, in the story, is still Jesus preaching and teaching in the temple. Depending on the timeline you look at, he spends about 3 days after he clears out the money changers and sort of takes over, especially the court of the Gentiles, as being a teaching place, as being a place in the temple for people from all walks of life to join and learn and share with one another and celebrate and enjoy time and life together, and actually some good food. We get some allusions to that about that the community of the disciples was really stretching out their resources, their really very limited resources that they had pulled together in order to feed the people who were coming to see them and to have some decent celebrations in the run-up, in the festival week, in the run-up to the Passover. Jesus has his own particular ideas of how the Passover itself will be celebrated, and he is about to send the disciples out to find that upper room that he knows is ready for us. This comes a couple of days after his triumphal entry into Jerusalem, again in the way that he knows the young donkey will be prepared for him, and how he reenacts the entrance of King David, the coronation ritual that is right and correct and true to enter the city of Jerusalem. All of that sets up the opportunity to teach for a few days, but is also the great confrontation with the powers that be, that lead first to arrest, then to trial, then to crucifixion, and then to resurrection. So thanks be to God for that. And we celebrate that throughout the entire week. Ups and downs, highs and lows, bright, bright light, deep darkness, and then a new dawn. Today's reading is from the suggested reading actually for Saturday, for Holy Saturday, which has been a complicated day in the course of the life of the church, because of course Scripture doesn't really give us anything about it. What we hear is that it was the Sabbath day, and so no work was to be done. So what we're sort of led to believe is that all the disciples found quiet places to shelter and were quiet and indoors basically the whole day. What Jesus was doing is yet another question, and there's a whole giant structure built of that. Jesus went down in the course of the day, the second half of Friday and into Saturday, that he went down into hell to liberate all the people who had been trapped there, or liberate all the virtuous people who had been trapped there. This sort of depends on your theology of salvation or of what exactly you think of the role of hell as being. As recently as Dante in the Inferno, in the famous poem, the famous story about a trip into hell, he puts virtuous but unbaptized people in purgatory, in the highest, the least serious level of hell, but still condemned, and that includes a whole bunch of the virtuous people who lived before Jesus. This is really not a very productive line of debate to go down, but is part of the narrative very much about this dark, dark day where we really, people don't know what's going to happen next. The people at the time, and is a strange day for us in our present time. In part, of course, because it was the Sabbath at the time, and we celebrate the resurrection on the day that we treat as our Sabbath. Now, of course, really, and the structure of the week is kind of based on the Puritan idea that actually Saturday is supposed to be the Sabbath. Sunday is the Lord's Day. So you work for 5 days, then you rest for one, and that's Saturday. And then Sunday, the Lord's Day, is for doing the work of the Lord. So, of course, that's going to worship service, but also it's potentially doing a bunch of work for charity, effectively, in one way or another, to have a big charity event or a community event of that kind of a thing. So you have 5 days for yourself, 5 days to take care of yourself, 1 day to rest, and 1 day for the community, and especially for the Lord. So, on this Saturday, on this day that's supposed to be of rest, but is also this day of waiting, this day of the unknown, and this day where we've always sort of had this feeling like Jesus couldn't have just been lying there dead. We don't like that. That doesn't seem right. That doesn't seem consistent with his activity and his energy. And that it was the disciples who were inactive and being lazy, in effect, during that time. And it was only because of the social mores of the time that they didn't come and discover that Jesus was gone earlier. The women who find the tomb to be empty go as soon as it is socially acceptable for them to be. But Jesus doesn't stick to that kind of a thing. What we're going to be reading is an appropriate thing for a day like today. We're going to be reading from Lamentations chapter 3. And you might be wondering why I called it that in particular. You might have heard of this as being the Lamentation of Jeremiah. And you might have heard of Lamentation usually being included in the prophets. Most often it's put right after Jeremiah in the major prophets section in Scripture. But I am again reading out of Robert Alter's most recent translation and commentary about the Old Testament, and he lays things out in the traditional Jewish fashion, which puts the Lamentation with the writings. So this is the third of the 3 volumes. It's the medium-sized volume, and it's the everything else, but especially sort of wisdom literature. That are all these different sort of devices and collections and compendiums of different things that we're trying to talk about God in ways that aren't necessarily prophecy and aren't necessarily narrative. So this is Lamentations, which is put in about 2/3 of the way through. It's just before Esther and Ecclesiastes. And the fun thing about Lamentations is that it's 5 chapters long. And it constitutes a series of acrostic poems. That is, poems in which the first line of each, the first letter of each line of the poem spells out, when you read them vertically, spells out something. Now, there's a Proverbs right at the end. The virtuous woman section in Proverbs is an acrostic. And Lamentations is a collection of acrostics, with 3 out of the 5 being just simple alphabetic acrostics. So it's got a little bit of like almost a discipline through like the haiku form of that you go in order, effectively A to Z, in the Hebrew alphabet in that order, you go A to Z with lines reflecting basically on the Babylonian exile, reflecting on the fall of Jerusalem in pretty dramatic fashion, but in this very disciplined, structured way. This very disciplined, structured way that we actually can really only speculate as to why this was happening. It seems conceivable that this was try to make things more memorable. So it's an A to Z, like children's books sometimes are, A to Z of the fall of Jerusalem. Make it really memorable, make it really noteworthy, make it really a great mnemonic device to put these things together. Now there's 3 that are strictly like that, and then there's 1, which is what we're going to be reading, chapter 3, which instead of doing a regular acrostic, does a triple acrostics. That is, every 3rd line fills out and is this alphabetical order series of lines. So it's to put to add a little extra challenge of making it make sense to come back around every 3 lines to go through the alphabet to talk about the fall of Jerusalem, but also to talk more extensively about the faith in God. So it's sort of like every 3 lines, and we're back. Devotion to God, and we're devotion to God, devotion to God. So you end up with this rhythm, but it makes it, of course, since there are 22 letters in the Hebrew alphabet, it makes it 66 verses, 66 lines. So it's quite lengthy and gets kind of a little bit outside of where this is really a helpful mnemonic device because it's so long. The 5th and final chapter of Lamentations is just a 22-line poem without keeping that rhythm, without keeping the alphabetical order of the first letter. So there's all kinds of speculation about what this is. Potentially it's different people from one school of thought, all giving their hand at this form. There's also a thing that's been put forward that potentially it was the compiler. Somebody wanted to collect these poems. They found 4 of them and put them together and then tried to write one of their own to add on to the end. But we're not able to really do the full discipline system, so just wrote sort of an homage in this 22-line poem. The attribution of these poems, or of this whole thing before it was sort of, and for a long time it wasn't recognized as being poetry by people who don't read Hebrew or didn't have access to the Hebrew, which has been the vast majority of the interpreters of this scripture and of most scripture for the whole length of time of Christianity, since Hebrew almost entirely fell out of common usage and was almost a dead language until it was resurrected in the late 1800s. So we're going to be reading from chapter 3. That's the triple acrostic, and we're not going to read the whole thing. We're going to read about 30 verses, but you'll get sort of the rhythm of things. Lamentations, chapter 3. I am a man who has seen affliction. By the rod of his wrath he drove me off, led me away. Darkness and no light. Just to me he came back. Turns his hand against me all day. He wasted my flesh and my skin. He shattered my bones. He built up against me, encompassed me with misery and suffering. He made me dwell in darkness like those long dead. He walled me in. I could not go out, piled heavy bronze fetters upon me. Even though I cried out and shouted, he blocked my prayers. He walled in my way with hewn stone. He twisted my path. A lurking bear he was to me, a lion in hiding. My way he led astray, and he ripped me apart. He made me desolate. He bent my bow and stood me up as a target for the arrow. He drove into my innards the shafts of his quiver. I became a laughingstock to all my people, the theme of their taunts all day. He fed me full with bitterness, gave me wormwood's draught. He made me clench down on gravel, crush me in the dust. My life abandoned peace. I forgot what was good, and I thought my strength and my hope are lost before the Lord. Recall my affliction and my wandering, wormwood and poison, my very real life does recall and bends down upon me. That thus I answer to my heart, therefore I yet hope. The Lord's kindness has not ended, for his mercies are not exhausted. They are renewed every morning. Great is your faithfulness, my portion is the Lord, I said, therefore I yet hope for him. Good is the Lord for those who look to him, for the person who seeks him out. Good that he hopes in silence for rescue from the Lord. Good it is for a man that he bear a yoke in his youth. And that's verse 27, so we're going to stop there. But it does continue in much the same form, with very much, and you can hear a rhythm. This is speaks very much to us in this dark day after the crucifixion, especially because there are some parallels, of course, between what's described and what is also the story we tell of what happened to Jesus in the lead up and during his crucifixion and the act of crucifixion itself. This is used and brought forward sometime as a prediction of Christ, though it doesn't particularly closely align with what happens to Christ. But what's most often put forward is that the lamentation is the lamentation of Jeremiah. This is a comparison that's usually made just because of timeline, that Jeremiah is the most noteworthy character who is known to have been writing, who prophesied the downfall of the nation, of the kingdom of Judah, the fall of Jerusalem, and then was persecuted at great length and then had to flee and died in exile, apparently in sadness and despair. So it's the kind of thing we can imagine Jeremiah doing. There's no particular reason to attribute it to Jeremiah, or to put it, though it's generally in the right time frame, either for Jeremiah or perhaps more credibly for Jeremiah's assistant and scribe and friend Baruch, who continued to write on Jeremiah's behalf for some time after Jeremiah died, or that's as far our best guess about exactly what happened. So in any case, it's the kind of thing, the kind of affliction, the kind of abuse, the kind of difficulty that Jeremiah had in the course of his life, and then even afterwards, the struggles that his legacy continued to have, because of course legacy is also a big part of this. I became a laughing stock to all my people, the theme of their taunts all day. Jeremiah's being treated as a laughingstock when things are going well because he's ridiculous in that he's prophesying doom in the face of things going well. And then actually the contradiction of Jeremiah calling for faith and hope and taking steps even in his own life that are very faithful and hopeful is laughable to those who see that the kingdom of Judah is falling, to see that seemingly this whole followers of God thing isn't going to work out very well. So the ridicule with which Jeremiah is faced is similar, of course, to that which Isaiah, 1st, 2nd, and 3rd Isaiah, are all faced with in their own way. And the descriptions of them, and especially their being beaten down and sort of going into the gutter, and in both cases really probably dying of disease, and that being talked about of because of stress, because of abuse, because of poverty, and because of disdain from the whole community, that the health of these men deteriorates to the point, and old age, since they do prophesy for many decades, they deteriorate to the point of dying of disease, and it being really quite unsightly and unsettling, and that being even still further leveled against them as being a proof of God's vengeance against them or God's displeasure with them. This is falsely associated with being predictions of Jesus sometimes, that Jesus would, by his stripes, by his stripes we are healed, but that this is not a punishment for somebody who has done wrong in the case of these prophets, but is indeed the punishment by human beings and is just part of the redemptive process. Jesus's redemption through suffering is similar, but they really are talking about different things and reflecting on somebody who died and was dead, not somebody who resurrected, and somebody who died of disease and in a dark hole, basically, who had been relegated to a dark hole, rather than one who was executed very publicly by an adversary of the people, and by a corrupt system, and then rose again, and so was not dead. All of this, of course, is to say that you can the Lamentation, and indeed much of the other writings of prophets and similar writings, because again, Lamentation is not in the books of the prophets because it's not really prophecy. It's not written by one of the named specific prophets, nor is it of the form of prophecy. It's poetry. It's sad poetry, but sad poetry, well, we have lots of sad poetry up to the present day. Different times and different eras have found different things to make beautiful, and different things to reflect on and to try to challenge one another with really in every time, to find ways to share deep feelings and to be true to oneself in the terms of deep feelings, both in ancient times and the present day. And poetry can work really well for that. And especially poetry where there's a very rigid structure, a very formal set-up way to put things in, so it's almost like you're solving a problem. Acrostics are sometimes put forward as almost being like you can do a crossword puzzle that's in acrostic form. That's actually how I became first familiar with acrostics, and the fact that acrostics, or I guess I became familiar with the term acrostics. We do acrostics actually very frequently in the present day, but we normally do them in like third and fourth grade, or second and third grade, because it's learning sort of words and spelling and word structure and brainstorming about different words rather than about sentences so much. But acrostics, frequently we do acrostics of describing ourselves using our name, and I never really was very happy with that, because J as a first letter of the first name just didn't. I felt like I didn't have as many choices for like fun adjectives, though I mean there are certainly worse letters. I would recognize that, no question. But anyway, the Lamentation is 5 very interesting chapters. 5 chapters that are the same format, but kind of different. Really the same format, but really sort of different takes on that. So there's reason to believe they were all written by different people. There are reasons to believe they were written by one or maybe 2 people, just trying out different spins on the same format, or even something like the same person taking a crack at this form, a crack at trying to describe the emotions of the whole community 5 different times at different stages of their life. We're going to get into, in the cycle of the church year, going from reading from Luke quite frequently, because Luke gives a very, very detailed account of the Last Supper and the crucifixion and the entry into Jerusalem and Jesus' time in Jerusalem during Holy Week. He's one of our main sources for Holy Week, but then it's thought that the same author wrote the Gospel according to Luke and the book of the Acts of the Apostles, which is following John and describes not only Jesus' final acts after his resurrection, but then the journey of the apostles, especially of Peter and Paul, in sort of the first few years of their ministries. So it's said that, and it's thought that they were written by the same person, but it's especially thought that Acts was written by the same person quite a lot later in his life. And there's debate about this, but you can sort of, there's questions about whether there's a more like settled perspective, a little bit more jaded, but also more settled in himself, and less sort of youthful enthusiasm, but more sort of wisdom in the telling of the Acts of the Apostles versus the Gospel of Luke. And perhaps this is a similar thing in Lamentations. Now, of course, there's no guarantee that we have them in the right order, especially if something's compiled like that, or if there really is even an order. Especially if they were 5 different poets, it could have been just that they were put in order that the editor thought of the importance or quality of the poems. Certainly things have been ordered in Scripture for stranger and, frankly, stupider reasons than that, but that would not be a bad one to imagine. But altogether, before the pandemic, it was really hard stuff to hear and stuff that people, I feel like, didn't really relate to. But we're having as I've said before, we have a whole new perspective, really, especially on the Old Testament world, on just despair. I do find interesting there's a specific attribution specific comparison that's put forward in the face, perhaps, of those in the community who are trying to make excuses about the fall of Jerusalem. But it says, in verse 5, it says, God, he built up against me, encompassed me with misery and suffering. He made me dwell in darkness like those long dead. He walled me in. I could not go out. Piled heavy bronze fetters upon me. Even though I cried out and shouted, he blocked my prayer. He walled in my way with hewn stones. He twisted my paths. All of those are evoking of a siege, of a long siege by a large army surrounding, and then actually, usually the way you would conduct a siege in ancient times is to build another around, you have the walled city in the middle, so around that walled city, you build another walled city, constituting your army, but it's a wall to keep them in rather than to keep you out. So this is a description not just perhaps in response to the exaggerated stories or the rising stories about how huge and just completely overwhelming that the force of Babylon when they laid siege to Jerusalem was. This is saying that God is still greater, that God, he builds up against me. That's specifically referencing siege works. He builds siege works, siege towers, siege walls. Encompasses me misery and suffering. He makes me dwell in darkness. So this is so surrounded that it's blotting out the sun. That God's power is so great that it's far greater than any siege wall, because a siege wall would not be so great as that it could blot out the sun. He walled me in, piled heavy bronze fetters upon me. So this is, again, imprisonment. And then he walled in my way with hewn stone. He twisted my paths. So building a stone wall, not a temporary wall, but like a permanent siege wall, is a colossal undertaking. And then it's twisted my paths. And then you go into talking about there's a lurking bear he was to me, a lion in hiding. This is twisted paths alludes to it being more and more difficult as the siege goes on to get anything in or out of the city, that it's more and more tiny, twisting, difficult, hidden paths that are the few or very, very few that are remaining. We have a little bit of an idea. Of course, Jerusalem was originally built in the location it was because of a spring and a defendable mountaintop. But that's David's ancient city, and by this point we had sort of moved on, and the city was much larger and more spread out in the valley. But still, the spring, the pathway through the spring, it's there's some porous rock, so there are a lot of caves in the area. There would have been secret paths, but not with God. With God, there are no secret paths. With God, you have no secret way to get in or out. God is greater than Babylon. So even in that, you have actually a very hopeful thing being put forward by this author. But talking in the kind of parlance and the kind of language that probably would have been commonplace. Remembering the siege, talking about how great, how awful, but how huge the siege was. And really that being very overwhelming and very, very dominant in the conversation most of the time. So, dear friends, for this Holy Week, and with a lot to come out of, just a little passage certainly there. For this Holy Week, I will bid you goodbye. May God bless you all, and a very, very happy Easter. We have some dark times indeed, but the resurrection is coming. So, dear friends, be well, stay safe, keep in touch, and we'll see you again soon.